Hello, everybody. This is Editing Vivian. I'm just popping in before the episode to tell you that Holly's audio is not fantastic this episode, but because we had a guest, it's a little bit harder to just redo. I have done what I could in places just to make sure that they're audible, but it's not the cleanest sound, and I'm really sorry about that. We have figured out what went wrong, and future episodes will not have that problem anymore. Sorry.
Hello and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, the podcast about the world of nerdy wonderfulness through the objects that we love. My name is Holly Swinyard, and with me is Vivian Asimos. Asimos! I never get your surname right, and I'm so
Asimos.
sorry.
It's fine.
Asimos.
No one does.
I feel bad because I've done like 12 episodes of this podcast.
My supervisor was my PhD supervisor for 4 years and still didn't get it right, so it's fine.
Okay, I'll try harder. But also, we have an extra voice today. What's this? A guest? I don't know how we swindled this, but we did. So with us today is somebody who, if you are into comics, you will know. If you're into Star Wars, I hope you know. He's written comics of The Wicked and Divine, and definitely didn't wave at me for 5 minutes at New York Comic Con when I was very jet lagged and did not recognize him until he walked past me. And I'm so sorry about that still. It's Kieron Gillan.
Yay!
Thank you for having me, Holly and Vivian. It's lovely to be here, and I will continue waving at you indefinitely.
Just throughout the podcast.
Yeah, exactly. That's what you guys need to picture forever now. It's just Kieron showing up at my house and just waving outside.
Yeah. I'll send you a GIF. It'll be fine. It's like you put it on and just running perpetually.
Exactly. That's what I need in my life. It'll be my support network. Anyway, the reason we wanted to have Kieron here, and thank you for joining us, is that we wanted to talk about Vivian's favourite subject, which is religion and pop culture, but specifically gods and myths and legends in comic books. And who better to ask other than possibly Neil Gaiman than Kieron? So, you know.
Yes. Or like, there's lots of people. I think comic people, they can't leave myth alone. So it's like you throw a brick, you probably hit a comic creator who can have a few
probably
things
just grab
to say.
anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, they're just like, frankly, a random stranger. Comic book creators aren't that interesting. But I'll try my hardest.
For people who don't know, I would say probably, I don't want to say your most known work is The Wicked and Divine, because there's loads of them, but it's definitely one that captured the imagination in the recent years, which is about, and I'm going to get this wrong, gods coming to Earth and being pop stars, sort of musicians.
That's why the way I use this picture is gods as pop stars and pop stars as gods, because the kind of the duality is important. It's not one or the other, and we kind of go back and forth between the two of them, and it's a book about everything.
What was it particularly about those sorts of characters? Because obviously, there's conversations to be had around pop stars being modern figures of worship, Taylor Swift. But why did you decide to pick those rather than any particular other type of celebrity?
Wicked is designed as a capstone for I was 38 when I conceived it. In the wake of my dad's terminal cancer diagnosis, explicitly it's this kind of I'm going to put away everything I've ever loved as a teenager and later. My entire early part of my life is gone over now, and it's a story about these gods who incarnate in humans form and perform people, change the world, generally reach people on a personal level, and then they're dead. They're dead in 2 years. So at the age of 38, I had a story about people being dead in 2 years. You may see what I was doing. It wasn't subtle. So what was interesting me about that, as it's my response to grief. That's the first thing. And it's one of the things why be anything? That kind of it's his death is this inevitable thing. And the shortening it to 2 years was about intensifying. Because it doesn't matter if you have 2 or 5 or 10 or 50 or 70 or 500 years. It's still, to quote Gaiman, as we referenced earlier, brief life. They're all brief lives. So the 2 years made it much tighter. And specifically, it's also why the hell are you wasting your life being a creator? So what's a useful way to, it's true, why do this? So the gods are creators. That's kind of the idea of, a lot of people, especially when it's Hollywood people, they get caught up on the celebrity side. The idea that they're the worship of the gods, which of course is in there. It's interesting.
Yeah.
But that's a side effect. That's not really why creators are interesting. Creators are interesting because they create. And the same way gods are interesting because they create. That's the metaphor. And the idea that by turning into gods who create this kind of higher level of art is basically the idea. That focuses the metaphor. And then would you give the rest of your life up to be Michelangelo? It's that kind of, that's really what the story's about. As in, okay, you have 2 years to live. You'll be really good, but you'll be dead in 2 years. And of course, the story's not really about that. You know what I mean? It's an unpacking and examination of the lies that go into creative myths like that. But at the same time, it is also about that. So that's where it kind of comes from. Specifically on Wictive, the idea of these beings go through time, appearing through time every 90 years. That's the other part of the myth. Influencing the world, then going. Because the other thing the book is, but you know, it's their pop stars this time. But like the myth is every 90 years, these 12 gods appear, or 12 gods appear rather. And every 90 years there's something different. Like we do stories back 90 years ago with basically modernist poets versus jazz musicians. That's kind of the pantheon's kind of half split. We go back 90 years before that, we're doing a riff on the Romantics, primarily the Romantics. We go back and do one circa the fall of Rome, and we're kind of talking about the nature of art there, because art was very much looked down upon in lots of different ways. In fact, if I was doing a different book, it would have been about the idea that to be a speech maker was probably the art in Rome, but I didn't do that approach. And all the way through, it's the idea of like so we're going every 90 years and basically saying, okay, in this period, these are the culturally influential people, and we'll throw them through our metaphor. So that's the kind of thing. So it's a kind of a cultural history of the world. There's this one particular episode, everyone, frankly, it's like being hit by the hammer repeatedly, but it's basically every panel goes forward 90 years, and it's basically 6,000 years of human culture. As in, okay, this time the pantheon's in Mesopotamia. This time we're over somewhere in East China. Here, like, so every panel is researched to the period, what were people doing there. Like, it's ridiculous. It almost killed us, especially nearly killed Jamie.
I mean, I remember Jamie drawing it, and the tweets were quite entertaining all the time.
I don't know what we were thinking, but yeah, that's the broad sort of shape of it. And of course, I've done a lot of stories about gods in different ways, but that's what interested me there. The idea of them as an intensifier for like what it is to be a creator, or at least the myth of being a creator. And
it works so well. Yeah, it does work so well, because I think it does. If you're a creator, you really connect with that thing of like, how much of my life am I giving to this? We literally said this before we started recording. It's hard, you know. We all know that stress. We all know what it's like to create things and what it is to put out into the world. I don't think I've actually read all of it, but what I have read of it, every so often it just be a gut punch. They'd be like, oh, then that's true of Journey into Mystery, which you hit me in the face of repeatedly, and I think I got my own back in one sense at least, about dressing up as Kid Loki and not kicking in the face. Definitely not. What? No.
I mean, also definitely the author. You know, definitely the author needs to be turned much more literal in that way. Yeah,
I think so. There is definitely something in that discussion about what it means to be a creator and what that comes with, all the weight of it. So
I mean, so in a very real way, it's like I mainly write tragedies. Like that's not true. I write bittersweet stories is the best way of putting it. Almost people, especially Journey into Mystery, as you know, Holly, gave me a reputation as a heartbreaker. And almost all my stories end better than Journey into Mystery does. As in, like, I find some hope, because if I didn't have hope, I wouldn't be alive. I mean, the whole thing about Wictive is it's about why be a creator? And you've got to assume I find a reason, because I wouldn't be here otherwise. You know, also the other question is why be alive? And that's equally true of that. So you know what I mean? Like I lean bittersweet because I can't, you know, because death is fundamental. But like it's still sweet in some ways.
Can I ask a question that I recognize could lead to you sounding probably more egotistical than you most likely are? But in this discussion about thinking of creators in this way, and you are one in a field of nerdiness that has quite a fan reaction to things and people and connections in that way. That's why we're doing this podcast and what I study a lot. So do you feel like a god?
Oh no. I tell you what, there's one, I mean, you know this, you're writers, but you know the moment when everything is working and you're flowing and you're creating on the page and you're aware that it's good. Like it's quite often it's just like pulling teeth, but occasionally the whatever counts as the spirit that possesses you, the words of fire on the page, and you know it's good. Yeah, then you feel like God. But that's not about people. You know, that's the idea of like, oh no, this is really working, and we are creating. This is kind of why I come to the Wictive. Wictive is about creation. That's what the god's power is. It's not about being a celebrity. That's just a byproduct. And that's the that we think about gods in multiple ways. Like, you know, I mean, obviously doing the full theology thing. like various aspects in Aristotelian or Platonic, I don't remember which way around it is, the idea of what is God made of. And there's various aspects to that. And we can think, oh no, God's about being worshipped. And that's one way of looking at it. And the other way is God is the creator, which is a very different way of looking at it. So I was interested in how those things unpack and map. Wick Div is I don't want to literally spoil it, because especially because Holly hasn't read the end. Like the whole thing is a cautionary tale about it all. Like most of my stories are fundamentally about lies we tell ourselves. And the most dangerous lies are the lies we choose to believe because we want to believe them. And also, especially if you think a story someone says about you is true, that's when you have to be most aware, because if you think it's true, you're going to fall for it. And that's a lot of Wick Div is about that. The idea that you mentioned gaming earlier, and it's like one of those things. And obviously, I love gaming. Weirdly, not as big of influence on me as people tend to think. Not in a bad way. Like, obviously, I think it's great, but like I got most of the stuff I got. People think I got from gaming from Pratchett.
Sorry, we have to put the Terry Pratchett's been mentioned.
We mentioned Terry Pratchett every episode.
Yeah. I don't like.
It wasn't me this time.
We'll come back to Pratchett in a bit if you want. If I had to paraphrase gaming's basic position on stories are powerful and magical. Isn't that wonderful? And my basic position: stories are magical and powerful. Be very scared of stories. They're petrifying objects that will control you and eat your brain alive. And anyone who's seen the social media will see how our stories destroy us. And in fact, to go back to Pratchett, treating people like things is a story that any story that allows us to view someone else as a thing is a story that's turned us into a murderer. All that, I think, is the stuff that runs through my work. And that kind of applies to the idea of thinking yourself as a god. Like some creators fall down that hole. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The idea that, no, you need to stay humble because you're not. Yeah. And like, at the very worst, God, you occasionally feel like one, but it's not true. Holly, like you would, you're somebody who came to me as a fan of the Journey to Mystery, but like I was this time at Young Avengers, especially for circa Young Avengers, like 50 cosplayers in a small area at a con with me or something, and it was berserk, and that feels like you're kind of having a break from reality because these people who've been inside your head are now milling around like being John Malkovich. The thing you kind of have to learn very quickly, or at least me and Jamie did, it's never about you. It's about people who come to you about something they found in the work, and all you are is kind of a walking altar. Like they've come to you because they want to talk about how they feel about something, and you can't do anything because you've already done the thing. And what really happened was they came to the work and found something about themselves in it. So all you can do is basically be a kind of walking like statue for them to sort of talk to, and you try to make it as nice as possible for them, because it's about them. It's never about you, and that's kind of what I think the attitude I like to try to convey as a human being. And I think it goes very wrong when you don't, because treating people like things goes both ways, including yourself.
It definitely feels like that is a good metaphor for how fandom should be viewed. Like people find something of themselves in stories, and actually it's not the creator behind the story necessarily that did that. We literally just talked about this with the author. Oh, in the episode that's going to come out after this.
Oh,
spoilers.
Yep.
How people are looking for things in stories that the author may never have intended to be there. It's and you can't necessarily even claim that it was you went, oh yeah, I totally meant to do that.
Where my normal reservations of Death of the Author is, it's going to become that any take on a piece of work is true, and that's definitely not what Death of the Author meant. Death of the Author means you have to make an argument over what the text says. Like Suki Young Avengers, I remember writing a load. Here's a brief introduction to critical, and you know this. Sorry about this, listeners, but the whole kind of like if someone said Young Avengers is set in Paris. That's clearly untrue. It's just in the first panel, it's set in New York, stuff like that. And that is a very bad argument and will probably be mostly rejected. And there's lots of other, and it kind of goes on a scale. Can you make an argument supported by the text? Because quite often people have a take on your work and you can explicit. And this is the interesting thing. It's like Death of the Author includes I don't have anything better than my arguments about the text to say what it means. But I can, if I wanted to, say, I don't think your argument is true because this, and this. Can you disprove this position? Otherwise, you're going to have to back away from your position. Now, I mostly don't pick fights because my life's too short, and also people are allowed to do what they want in the work. But the flip is that is still true, as in you've got to be able to defend the position. Otherwise, the position is just making up nonsense. And scene.
Coming back to Pratchett, it's something I always find very interesting is seeing how many takes there are on the stories that he told. Like how I have seen so many people argue that the storyline for Cheery is a trans storyline, whereas others argue that it's a women's liberation storyline. Others talk about it being a gay liberation storyline. It's one that it really depends on what you read into it. But I don't think he necessarily thought it was any of those things. He may have considered some of it, but probably not all of it. I was just thinking that it's very telling that the story works well enough that people are able to read so many different degrees into it. I literally saw somebody talk the other day about unseen academicals and how they read Mr. Nut as an allegory for being intersex. And the things, whereas I read it as an allegory for being a person of color, it read to me more like being a person of color or being working class. And like the things that maybe that made more sense, particularly since the character is an orc and the history of orcs kind of, there's a whole thing around that. But I thought it was super interesting to see someone read something that I had never even considered into that. And the way they, said it out, I was like, actually, yeah, totally. That makes complete sense. I can totally see why that works, but it's not what I saw.
So I love reading people's criticism, not as in criticism, not even of my own stuff, but people's criticism broadly, because tell me about how you see this work. You know what I mean? Because that's always interesting, because that's just humans talking about art they love. Like, I'm very much like, I used to be a critic, so that's my background. So yeah, I'm fascinated by that kind of stuff. I mean, like, I'm just stopping writing the X-Men at the moment. And when people talk about, no, they sacked me.
No!
They didn't sack me. They probably would have sacked me if I tried to stay. But it's like, bye. People talk about the X-Men metaphor, and of course, I don't like the phrase. Like's the wrong word. I think the X-Men metaphor is confusing because wasn't created as a metaphor. What the X-Men is applicability. It's a kind of a one-size-fits-all alienation metaphor. And at different stories and different points in time, they have bits of the metaphor have applied, bits of the story have applied to different groups in different ways. And writers have done it consciously or unconsciously. But it doesn't mean it's not like Animal Farm. It's not meant to be you're thinking, this one's Martin Luther King. That's not the point. But because the metaphor immediately breaks down because gay people can't shoot lasers out their eyes, as far as I'm aware. And
that's what they want you to think.
We haven't told anyone, but we
as a bisexual, I shoot out of one eye. It's just kind of...
We've uncovered the gay agenda.
Oh no, but you know what I mean. Like, but it is applicable, and it's also about the feelings that we have. This is what it can feel like in this way, and the word applicability I find really interesting in that way. And I recognise this truth, and recognising truth is a lot of what fiction is about too.
No, I think it's always really interesting because I study mythology as my background at like universities and stuff. And having to make an argument that pop culture is important was always a very difficult argument to make to a crowd of old academics who don't give a crap. But it's always wonderful whenever I get to get out of that world, which I have now been out of that world for a while. But every time that I get to hear somebody new, like how you're talking about stories where it's like, those were the arguments that I was making those are all stories and ways that we talk about mythology. As mythology are these stories that we can mold and alter. The history of stories changing over time is not because of oral recitation being bad. It was actually actively chosen to be changed by storytellers because they wanted their own creative license, or maybe they wanted to reach a certain audience that was not reached before, and they actively changed those things. Those things that you're saying, either unconsciously or consciously, they are both a lot of these times. And it's still happening. And I think what's really interesting about comic books in particular is this weird web of alternate universes and current universes, and all of those things allow for the kind of multitudes of types that we have in, say, versions of Persephone and Hades or something like that. You can kind of see similar takes on the same narrative told in different ways by different comic book artists and comic writers.
I completely get what you mean. Like, one of the things in Wick did was, I mean, we're heading minus. I'm not going to spoil too. I've already probably spoiled too much of it, but like, at least part of Wick is, these gods appear every 90 years, and eventually it's not that they're being incarnated as much. It's the people stepping into the role. So it's like you see Lucifer's all the way down the story, and each Lucifer is a bit similar, but each Lucifer's also very different. You know what I mean? And that's kind of like what's these. So that in some ways these god artists in the story are about stepping into the role and, okay, what will my Lucifer be? And that's what story. I mean, we talk about actors doing that, as in who will my Lear be? But storytellers do that when doing a traditional story, as you're aware. I mean, this is like legend stuff rather than mythology. But one of the other books they did called Once and Future is basically a story about, it's an Arthurian story, perhaps unsurprisingly, but its main kind of its basic device is treating Arthur like the mummy. as in like the idea. Oh, it's an undead monster. He's come back to kill everybody. But the sort of the thing it does. Oh yeah, first thing it does is kill. It's like a bunch of like British nationalists bring him back for reasons to get basically racist reasons. Then he immediately murders them all because they brought back the original Arthur, who of course is Welsh, and the invaders he hates are Anglo-Saxons. So that's kind of, it starts from there and goes. But the other thing it eventually does is the story is less interested in the specific Arthurian myths, though there's quite a lot of it in there. It's about how the myth was changed over time. So you meet the French period Arthur, you meet the early Welsh Arthur, you meet the Victorian era Arthur, and how the Arthur was originally like an anti-Saxon figure, but he was taught by the French and turned into this like weird fanfic creature, and all the way different periods Arthur was used in different ways. The same as like Robin Hood, who eventually turns up in the story in the same reason. Yeah, we are using these gods to tell stories in different ways, and of course we say the myth between, I just saw about Lear. He turns up in Once in the Future, and of course Lear was originally a water god. But the story is basically because no one thinks about Lear as a water god; they just think about King Lear. So the actual story, and King Lear isn't a water god in the play by Shakespeare. So the story is about Shakespeare chained Lear in a ritual, which is the play, and made sure that no one would ever, basically made sure the god of Lear will never be released on the earth again in the story. I think at some point, my story obviously is freed again. But the point being is that a story killed a god there. Lear is no longer worshipped in any. I mean, I'm sure some pagans are, but like Lear as a god in culture, we like Thor. Conversely, in the Marvel movies, is thought about a lot. Lear is not thought about as a god anymore because 500 years ago, a guy sat down and wrote a story about him, and that's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting piece of deicide by Shakespeare if you think about it through that angle.
Yeah. And actually, it's interesting because I actually saw a mutual friend, Emma Vitelli, talking about Shakespeare in regards to King Richard III.
Yes.
And the way that basically Shakespeare wrote one play, and that's it. That's how we think about him from now on. That's it. That particular play informed so much history, including historical research, not just what's taught in schools and taught in English, but also the kids in history classes. And essentially, Shakespeare had an awful lot of power. Has anyone done that story yet? That Shakespeare had way too much power, apart from Doctor Who that one time.
I mean, Sandman does a bit of it. I mean, obviously, but it's interesting because I mean, this is obviously Alan Moore riff, and we go back to again Welsh bards. And they would ridicule you in a piece, a satire, and then you'll be laughed at 100 years later or 1,000 years later. People will be laughing at you then.
And it's interesting as well because you've written Loki in various different forms. We talked about Journey into History, but you have written Loki grown-up adult, not kid Loki, before then, and then you wrote the teenage version in the Young Avengers afterwards, and talking about that character being sort of different and separated. What's that like, having to come to a different same character? Do you think of them as different characters, or are they the same person but different facets of them?
I think the interesting, like a little bit.
Yeah,
like, they definitely at some point they've become different people. Like obviously had. Trying to avoid spoilers for Journey into Mystery, but yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Like
a long time ago, guys.
The different people merge it in different ways. That's interesting. What I find, I've also written like straight Loki, not straight Loki, but like, why would I do that?
Yeah.
But I've written a short. I did a short story in a queer anthology, and I've completely forgot. I've literally got the name. Geeks Out, I think it's called. Yeah, Geeks Out, and I did like specifically about ergi, which is the shameful sex in final way. So it's very much specifically a story about God as Loki as god of ergi and how that relates to these two people in a relationship. And that's of course very different because there's if people who obviously know Norse mythology, which is everyone listening to this podcast probably, the one small interesting tweak Marvel did to the mythology of Thor was of course making not uncle, Loki not Thor's uncle but his brother, and that's such a huge change. You know what I mean? That's a phenomenally, unless I'm being an idiot here, but you know what I mean? Like that fundamentally changed Marvel Thor in a completely different way. And I saw someone doing a Thor comic, and they clearly thought, I could do a Thor comic, and I'm allowed to do that because as long as I don't use any of Marvel's visuals. But it's like, oh no, you're clearly taking the story from Marvel because you're making him brothers. You know what I mean? Like, and that way, it's like how many people in pop culture will think about Loki in the same way? And obviously, Hiddleston changed it. Like how Loki will never go back to how he was in the comics because the incredibly iconic performance by Mr. Hiddleston.
No, I think that Tom Hiddleston's performance, in some ways, I feel like your sensitive writing of him in Journey into Mystery and then as in the Young Avengers, I do feel particularly in the Loki series there is something of that in there. I mean, I know we see Kid Loki in the series as an actual character. But Tom Hiddleston's performance feels like he's taken something from the comics.
It's like hopefully, like I know he wrote a very sweet letter to the last issue of Journey to Mystery about how much he liked it. It was really genuinely very sweet. I got no idea if he actually read it or not, but it was a very sweet letter. You know what I mean? Like I always presume like celebrities have better things to do than anything really. If I was a celebrity,
Robert Downey Jr. definitely bought Iron Man comics.
True. And some people anyway. By the way, he wrote the letter. Let's assume he read it, and it's very sweet. And he saw akin to how he saw it. And it's the power of a role, the power of an act. I mean, this returns to the Wick Vivian, the idea. So Tom Hiddleston possessed Loki, and has now changed people's idea of Loki. You know, he in the Wick Div sense, he became the god of Loki, and now has changed what Loki means, at least for a generation.
So, and it's kind of hard. I feel like we talked about with the storytelling. These comic books, I think, are probably the closest we have to that nowadays. That these are stories that were created or were taken by people like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and all this kind of stuff, and then they made their own versions of these stories. And I mean, you could talk about DC in the same way. I mean, Superman is actually a retelling of Moses. It's kind of obvious when you look at it, unless you're Zack Snyder, apparently. Not going down that, not going into that route, sorry. But like comics, each writer who comes to a comic writes their own version of these characters. They are slightly different. I can tell the difference between, say, oh no, I can't remember any comic book writers off the top of my head. This happens every episode. Holly goes, I have a point to make, and I can't remember. You can tell the difference. You pick up one comic to another. There are definitely certain writers who I prefer. Like, not gonna lie, I really, really like Run on Batman. It's really good, but I'm not particularly a Batman person. I just like that one, and I have all of it. And the same is true of certain other, titles that I have a whole of Blue Beetle from like 2005 up to like 2015 because I really liked what they were doing with it. But I don't have anything either side of it. So it's just, I think people find different takes on these stories particularly enthralling, I guess is the right way to phrase it.
It's not quite one and the same, but it's also there's the overlap impact. I mean, to return to what we said earlier, the applicability is interesting. Like there's definitely some, you want to see the take on it. I remember the arguments like cover songs was actually, I think it was Warren Ellis's take of all people. But the idea that, everyone's Batman is their own Batman. And in some ways you're paying to see both Batman and not a different Batman. As in the idea, you want to see Grant Morrison write Batman and see what that looks like. And so on and so forth.
In the same way that I don't necessarily like Ben Affleck as Batman. I've really liked Robert Pattinson as Batman. Really enjoyed that film. I'm probably one of the only people who did.
I haven't seen it. Also, I've got 2 orders we've talked about off panel. Like, I haven't seen any Marvel movie in the cinema. Even the one I did, the Eternals, which of course is another kind of gods. That's the Chariot of the Gods approach. The idea that these are actual aliens, sort of alien creations, and are not actually gods. But I never saw that in the cinema because my wife did though. It's like Iris went as well. It was like a baby cinema, which is pretty amazing. Does all this making sense, Vivian? I mean, we're just sort of me and Holly are just rabbiting at each other and just aware.
That's what happens.
I mean, it's all stories, and I think that's what's kind of both broadly interesting about pop culture specific, like more generally, as well as when you get into the specific things, is you see all these crossovers between everything. Because, I mean, we're all just stories wrapped in flesh as people. That's just what we are, and so therefore, that's how we connect, and that's how we see ourselves and all of that. But I'm always going to advocate for for the importance of story.
It's impossible to imagine us without it, really. I mean, as you say, it's the ability to conceive of the future in the way that humans can is just basically story. The ability to model others' mind is story. It's an incredibly powerful tool.
Isn't that the whole point of the Hogfather? If we're going to do Predator references again, that's kind of how that book ends, is them talking about how stories are what makes us human. Yeah. We have to believe in things and have to make stories make things make sense, because otherwise it's just chaos. There isn't anything else. What
do you say? Like Homo narrativus is that what he used to say, wasn't it?
Yeah. And like, I mean, there actually in Discworld there is a god of stories, Narrativia, which I love, and that's basically how the world works. It's powered by Narrativia. I think it's really the production company is called.
But I mean, it is a lot of, like, that's when we sit down and we have a catch up like we did before starting to record. Those are stories that we're telling both about ourselves and about experiences that we had. And then when we go, oh, I have a similar story, then that's us connecting the threads of our various stories together. And now we feel connected to each other because our stories are interwoven now. It's just the way that we work.
It's almost like humans kind of need this nonsense. But, you know,
Yeah.
Exactly. So much of my story is about explicitly it's powerful and useful and essential, and I can't imagine it without oxygen because everything's a story. I'm so obsessed by the downsides of it. You know what I mean? Like that's the kind of like it's like cigarettes or whatever. Not like there's no amount of cigarettes you should be smoking, but like I kind of would like stories with warning labels on the side, not like trigger warnings, but just in kind of like warning may give you false ideas of the potential of love in this world.
I mean, I quite like that.
Yeah.
Something to basically be like, hey, your brain's gonna not think about anything else for the next like 3 weeks, and you're gonna make, you know, entirely an entire set of beliefs around this. Sorry, you know.
I think part of my worry about story is kind of born of my susceptibility to it. You know what I mean? It's like, oh no, I'm completely hyper impressionable, you know, to story. I mean, a lot of my work is also about the power of art and how much I love it. You know, not art broadly, as in somebody who's been transformed by art in a very real way. I can't hate it, and I certainly don't, but I'm always also aware of what it's done to me. Yeah.
Do you think that's because of like I'm autistic, so the way that I think, you know, if I get hyper focused on something or it becomes my special interest, I literally cannot think about anything else. It's almost detrimental. It can be detrimental to my health that a story will become an obsession. We're not going to talk about how much I played Pathologic for the last few weeks. Like we're just not.
Oh wow.
Because, yeah. Like I went hard on that game.
I got my ADHD diagnosis a few years ago, and that kind of the concept, you know, hyper focus as a concept fascinates me because it's about the only reason I get anything done. Actually, I just want to talk about Pathologic. In that, sorry.
Yeah, no, we can talk about that. That's fine.
I only played the original back in the day. Like, so obviously I'm that level of old, but like one of my friends, Quinton Smith, he did an amazing 3-part series. He's got Pathologic tattoos actually.
Wow.
Yeah. Quinton Smith, he founded Should Have Been Sit Down, the board game website. Now is doing Quinn's Quest, which is an amazing RPG YouTube channel.
Ooh,
yeah,
that's awesome.
Quick plug for him.
The worry as well as joy of the power of story and that kind of double-edged sword that it could have. But I think that's kind of, at least in my definition, to be technical about things, of mythology, that's kind of what myth is. So if you define a mythology the way that I do, which is that it's a narratives or something akin to a narrative that somebody uses to understand themselves or the world around them, then that can be a beautiful, wonderful thing that can connect LGBT kids that don't have access to each other through the internet and create webs of power and community and connection that can save lives. It can also bind together white supremacists and connect them and give them webs of power and connectivity. And, you know, it's one of those troublesome things where to give life to one thing, you can't have that without it being there for everybody. Not everybody is a good, decent human being.
You know, it's a story as a thing we release into the world and we're all infected with it. You know, like for better or worse. Actually, we can't talk about the word woke in any serious anymore because it's obviously been so poisoned. But when woke was a real word, I was always a bit twitchy over it, partially because white people probably shouldn't be using black slang as easily as they regularly do, and partially because it's exactly the same metaphor as the red pill, which, of course, the far is it the idea the world is like you need to wake up from a state of unconsciousness. And it's like that kind of like, and obviously that's true of like both sides of the argument, but it always made me suspicious of the use of the metaphor because it was that two-landed, you know, despite obviously getting the point. You know what I mean? Like it's the same myth. In the same myth, we're living in the cave, and we should leave the cave and be aware of reality. And it's tricky because like that's also really a compulsive. Your whole world is a lie is a really powerful story. How many stories have we started with? The hero discovers that the world is wrong. The world as they thought of is wrong. So one of my things, you know, they always have this in text for comics. It's like the truth is more interesting, you know, you never get, and the truth is much less interesting than was initially suspected. The truth, it was just it was just like a bat, you know. It wasn't a vampire, it was just a bat.
I feel that's a pretty good place to end. I feel like that's weirdly wound up everything we talked about, including the strange. We're going to go talk about Pathologic.
Do you have anything for people who want to follow you and know more about you and all that kind of stuff? Do you have anything you want to plug or shill?
I can't just plug Quinn's stuff. That'd be weird. If you could spell my name, KIERONGILLEN, which I imagine will be in the description at some point.
Yes.
I'm all over the social. I'm still abstractly on Twitter, but like I'm not posting there. Don't follow me. Like Blue Skies is probably where I tweet most. I've got a newsletter on Button Down. It's linked off my website, which is KieronGillan.com. Every week or two, I'll write to you and tell you what comics are out, and also download stuff like I've been talking about. I talk a lot about comics craft and ideas, and not being able to shut up. So yeah. Oh, and my bet, like I've got a book coming out in August called The Power of Fantasy, which is my next create your own book. But like, if you don't know me at all Wicked Divine completely exists. The first trade's dirt cheap. Pick it out and see what you think of it. Or steal it off the internet.
And read Journey into Mystery because it's good. It's really good.
Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it was awesome. It was nice to chat as well. We don't get to do this very often.
It is. Yeah. It's been forever, Holly. Yeah, and Vivian, a real pleasure to meet you.
It was lovely to meet you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm not sure this was as... when are we ever in any way sequential or normal or logical in any discussion? But
You're expecting too much of us, Holly.
I know. Thank you for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, or whatever. If you haven't, please leave a review. I never remember to say that. Please do. It's really helpful. We didn't really have an object this week. We had a Kieron. So
we had a guest. The guest was our object.
That's what I'm going with.
Just after talking about how we shouldn't think of people as things, let's go ahead and have Kieron be our object. That makes sense. Also, go buy Holly's book.
Oh yeah, it's called A History of Fans and Fandom. Also, please leave a review of that. And if you can, don't order it through Amazon. Please order it through your local book supplier and help them out, because that's the best we can do as well. So get bookshops to continue existing.
You can also order books through your library. They like to order new books typically, so you can request that your library purchase a copy. And we do, every time that someone checks out a book of ours from the library, we actually do get a percentage of money. Yeah. So that is a way to support writers in a way that is absolutely free to you. It is available as an option.
Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for listening to The Waffle. I hope you enjoyed it. I have been Holly Swinyard, and I will be again.
I have been Vivian Asimos. I cannot guarantee that I will continue to do so.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Remember to like, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast, and do give it a share. Tell your friends, family, and fellow fans and get the word out. You can follow us on social media, links in the show notes, as are some links to further reading. Who doesn't like a reading list? We are nerds after all. Music for this episode was Nowhere Land by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons Attribute 3.0. This episode was produced by Vivian, Asimos, and Holly Swinyard.